I would come and listen to James Clear again and again because I need someone like that telling me what consistently what I need to do.
I'm going to tell you two stories, tell you how those stories link together, and then how we can take them and apply those concepts. So they'll each provide a framework for thinking about the world and how it works, and then we'll take it from there. So to echo what Sebastian said, I'm from Ohio. I went to Ohio State for grad school, went to Denison University down the road in Granville for undergrad, and then I've been writing for the last 3 years at jamesclear.com. Site gets 700,000 to 1 million people a month visiting. You're welcome to check it out if you like, no pressure if you don't. And I'd like to start with a story about cycling. I'm not a cyclist myself, but the story that I came across provides a really interesting lens for thinking about human performance, not only in sports, but also in work and other areas of our lives. So, to set the scene, I'll tell you about the British cycling team. They weren't very good for about 100 years. They were really mediocre, middle-of-the-road performance. By 2003, they had won a single gold medal back in 1908. So they were actually so average that when they went to buy a new stock of bicycles, they were going to get like 200 new bikes. They reached out to some of the top bike makers in the world. And they asked them, and they wouldn't even give them a quote because the bike makers didn't want people to know that the British riders were using their bikes. So they were incredibly average on the world stage. And they hired a guy named Dave Brailsford right around this time. And they brought Brailsford in and they said, all right, we want to change this, right? We want to compete at a very high level. What's your plan for doing so? And Brailsford believed in this concept that he called the aggregation of marginal gains. And the way that he described it was the 1% improvement in nearly everything that you do. And so they started with things that you would expect a cycling team to look at, right? They got slightly lighter tires and put them on the bikes. They had their outdoor riders wear indoor racing suits because they were lighter and more aerodynamic. They had each rider wear a biofeedback sensor so they could see how each person responded to training and adjust things appropriately. They built more ergonomic seats for the bike, right? All types of stuff that you would expect a cycling team to do. But then they did a bunch of things you wouldn't expect a cycling team to do. So they taught each rider how to wash their hands to reduce the risk of infections. They wouldn't get cold and lose, training days. They split tested different types of massage gels to see which one led to the best form of recovery for the rider's legs. They had each rider figure out what type of pillow led to the best night's sleep for them, and then they brought it on the road to hotels when they were doing races. And Brailsford thought, if we can actually execute on this idea, right, if we can collect all these little 1% improvements, then I think that we could end up winning a Tour de France in 5 years. He was wrong. They won the Tour de France in 3 years, and then they repeated again the 4th year. Then after a year break, they won again, so in 2016. So they've won 3 of the last 4 Tour de France's. And they, at the Olympics in 2008 in Beijing, they won 70% of the gold medals available. At the Olympics in London in 2012, again, they won 70% of the gold medals available. And then just in 2016 in Rio, they won 60%. So this idea that 1% improvements are not just nice to have, or not just like little, cherry on top improvements, but actually can lead to significant success. That's the first story, right? This is the first frame of reference I want you to have. Okay, let's transition. Second story. 1800s, there's this guy named Vilfredo Pareto, and he's messing about in his garden, and he's looking at his peas in his garden, right? And he has these little pea pods, and he's a really mathematical guy. Pareto's legacy at this point, like from our vantage point, is that he was one of the people who turned economics into a mathematical science. Before Pareto, everybody just kind of had theories about how markets worked, and he actually took math and put it to that. Well, as a mathematician would, he looks at these pea pods and he starts measuring how many peas are coming out of the different plants. And he figures out that a few of the pea pods in his garden are accounting for almost all of the peas that are being produced. And that gets his gears turning. He thinks this is kind of a weird thing, right? This is an interesting pattern. And so at the time, he was analyzing the wealth in different nations. Now, he was Italian, so he started with Italy. and he realized that about 20% of the people in Italy owned 80% of the land. This is kind of where the 80-20 rule comes from, or the Pareto principle as it's called. But then he started looking in other places, and he looked at Britain, and he realized that about 30% of the people that lived in Great Britain at the time had about 70% of the wealth. And so it's not the numbers 80 or 20, it's just this idea that a few things account for the majority of the rewards. All right, so let's take that idea and contrast it with this idea of 1% gains that we just talked about. So on the one hand, we're saying if you make really small changes, it adds up to significant success. And on the other hand, we're saying, well, there are only a few things that really matter, and everything else isn't that important. By the way, it's really interesting to look at the 80-20 rule and how it plays out across our modern society. So if you take basketball teams, for example, there have been 65 NBA championships that have been played. The top 20% of the league has won 75% of the championships. And two teams, the Boston Celtics and the Los Angeles Lakers, have won 49% of NBA championships all time. So it's really interesting, right, that like these gains do accrue to a few people. There are a few people in any business, a few entrepreneurs, a few authors, right? All the rewards accrue to these people. So what's going on here? Well, all right, so those are the two stories. Let's link them together now. The first way that people think about the 80-20 rule, they usually think about it as a way of how do I focus on the things that matter, right? Okay, if only a few things matter and 80% of the results come from 20% of clients, or I wear 20% of my clothes 80% of the time, or 20% of the carpet in my room gets, or in my home gets walked on 80% of the time, then we have a few things that we should focus on and we should forget about the rest. That's a good way to think about the 80-20 rule and apply it. But what about the NBA team example? That's not really, you can't just get rid of 80% of the league and then have 20% that's winning the championship. Like, that's not what the 80-20 rule is saying there, right? It's saying that there are a few people where the majority of the rewards accrue. And what's interesting is that the 80-20 rule shows up time and time again in areas of relative comparison. So an area of absolute comparison is when your gains just stack on top of each other, right? So, I have one apple, and then I get two apples, and then I get three apples, and they absolutely add up, and the number of apples that I have is absolute, indifferent of how many apples you have. But as soon as we make it a competition, it becomes about relative comparison. If you have 11 apples and I have 10, you win, right? It doesn't matter my absolute gains because you have more. And this is the world that we live in. We live in a world of competition. It's wired into us from an evolutionary level, right? If you have two plants competing for sunlight, one gets a little bit taller than the other, gets a little more sunlight, so it grows a little bit more and gets to take even more sunlight, and it goes on, right? The relative comparison matters all throughout life. When we were on the African savannah, before we had, developed our modern society, if you were running away from a lion, you didn't have to be the fastest person on the savannah, you just had to be faster than Heavy Hal next to you, and he got eaten and you lived to see another day, right? And so relative comparison is what matters. In any area of relative comparison, 1% gains make a really big difference, right? So like take the Olympics. You can have two swimmers, one is 1/100th of a second faster than the other, but they get 100% of the gold medal. You can have 200 people that apply for a job, and one candidate's only a little bit better than the others, but they get all of the position. Our presidential election, you can have two candidates, one might only get 2% more of the vote than the other one, but they get all of the Oval Office, right? And so this is where 1% gains and small improvements start to connect with the 80-20 rule, which is that in a competitive world of relative comparison, when you have small areas of difference, the bulk of the reward still accrues to that person. It's just a little bit better, right? It's this winner-take-all effects. And when you play that out time and time again, let's take a business example. You have two sales teams. Sales team A is, say, 3% better than sales team B. So if they're presenting to your company, you consider both of them, but eventually you go with sales team A because they're slightly better. Then you do that again across another 50 clients, let's say. Well, maybe every now and then sales team B will win, but 80% of the time, 90% of the time, the bulk of the rewards are going to the team that is only slightly better. And so the lesson here is that the reason the 80-20 rule exists, the reason that this pattern plays out across society, that the bulk of the rewards accrue to a few people, is because the people who are able to collect those 1% gains and be just slightly better, they're the ones who win in an environment of relative comparison. All right, so that's how the two ideas link. Now let's talk about how do we actually accrue these 1% gains and utilize this in your daily life. There are many ways to make 1% improvements. We don't have a lot of time today, so I'm just going to give you one practical strategy. And that strategy is to build a feedback loop. The reason, and some of this ties back with what Sebastian said in the first talk, which is that people have tactics, people have something that they do that works for a little while, but then they don't repeat it long enough, right? We have something that works and then life gets in the way, we get busy again. So anybody can make 1% gains every now and then, but the problem is they're often followed by a 1% decline, and then you just kind of sit on this plateau where you stay at the same place before. In order to actually build enough 1% gains to capture those winner-take-all effects, you need to accrue time and time again. And the way that those accruals happen is through feedback loops. Let me give you a couple examples. So feedback loops happen because we have a measurement of our current behavior that leads or acts as a trigger for our next behavior. So let's say you get a prescription. There's this thing called the glow cap, and you can put it on the top of your prescription bottle, set it on your kitchen counter. It gets to be 8 a.m. and you're supposed to take your pills. The glow cap will start glowing to remind you, hey, come over and take your medication. If it gets to 8:10 and you haven't taken it yet, it'll pulse a little bit faster, try to catch your attention. If you get to 8:15 you haven't taken it, it sends you a text message. It says, hey, remember to take your pills. Each of those is a form of measurement of your behavior, right? And then once you take it, then you get the measurement acts as a trigger for your next action. Another example. So I have a friend who wanted to build better posture. Posture is one of the most annoying habits in the world to create because as soon as you start talking to somebody, you forget and then you slump your shoulders again, right? So he assumed good posture in the morning, took a little piece of tape and put it across his shoulder, scotch tape, so that whenever his shoulder slumped, he would get a little tug, right? And that's another form of measurement. It acts as a trigger for his next action. I feel the tug, I put my shoulders back. So measurements don't have to be quantitative, but they often can, right? So let me give you a practical one that you can apply to almost any situation. Jerry Seinfeld, one of the most famous comedians of all time, when he was starting his show, he was still touring, right? It was maybe first or second year of the Seinfeld show being out. And there was this young comedian named Brad Isaac who came to see, he was opening for Seinfeld that night. He catches Seinfeld backstage. He says, Mr. Seinfeld, love your work. Do you have any tips for a young comic? Do you have any suggestions on how I could improve? And he says, well, the secret to being a better comic is to write better jokes. And the secret to writing better jokes is to write every day. So here's what I think you should do. Get a big wall calendar, okay, where you can see every day of the year mapped out on it. And each day that you do your task of writing jokes for 15 minutes, say, I want you to put a little X on that day. He said you'll have a couple false starts here and there, but at some point you're going to get a string 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 days in a row. And at that point, your only goal becomes don't break the chain. Doesn't matter how good or how bad your jokes are, doesn't matter how you feel about them, doesn't matter if it ever makes it into the work, just don't break the chain. And I like to add something else onto that, which is that top performers mess up just like everybody else. But the thing that they do that's so key is they get back on track more quickly. So when you have a chain going, your goal is don't break the chain. When you slip up, your idea is never miss twice. Doesn't matter if you have a slip up, right? Your only target though, once you miss is to get back on track as quickly as possible and start a new chain. So don't break the chain, never miss twice. That calendar can be used for almost anything, right? I have friends who are videographers who, if they do their 30 minutes of video processing, they put an X on that day. I have a buddy who is a weightlifting coach. If he goes to the gym and trains that day, he puts an X on that day. So whether it's personal habits or work habits, that's a way to build a feedback loop that is measuring your behavior and gives you a trigger for either don't break the chain or never miss twice. And that's how to apply it. Thank you very much.
I took so many notes during the session. I actually have like at least 30 pages worth of notes.
Oh, he lives up to his name, Clear. It was I really like that all the philosophies that he was explaining to us, he has implemented them himself in his life, and I really liked his analogy of life as like a car.
I found James to be rather refreshing in the advice that he gave. I thought he was really good. I loved his little fun quirk about the posture because everybody has awkward body language, and we should all work on that, right?
I learned a lot of like how to keep your days organized and how to achieve your goal, like how do you do things every day and how to keep yourself more motivated.
His talk is what you need to get started on your dreams.